Welcome everyone to Bay Area Council's Impact Bay Area webinar series. We'll get started shortly. Okay, welcome and hello again to Bay Area Council's Impact Bay Area webinar series, where we explore the region's most pressing issues with top business, civic, and community leaders. And that includes yourselves, our audience members. I'm Xiomara Cisneros, Policy Director for the Bay Area Council. I focus on housing, sustainable development, and land use. And speaking of housing, because of shelter in place, our homes now serve a multi-function purpose. It's now our childcare centers, it's our gym, it's our hair salons, and most relevant to this discussion, it's now our office spaces. I'm sure most of you are watching this from home in your home/office. So if we're all watching this from home, what's happening to our office buildings that we've left behind? So that's what we're going to talk about today, the impact of COVID-19 on the commercial real estate market. And also, what does that mean as we look forward in terms of the design and operations of office buildings? Before we get started, we really want this to be an interactive discussion. So please come with your questions. You have the Q&A function below where you can start logging your questions, and then we'll open it up for the audience around maybe 11:40. Okay, and I'll go ahead and set the stage in terms of the conversation for today. A few months ago, which felt like a lifetime ago, the Bay Area was the hottest office market in the country, higher rents than New York and competitive with other global markets. We had employers hiring like crazy, and therefore they were competing for office space. In fact, San Francisco's unemployment was as low as 1.8%, bringing office rents to historic highs. And then the global pandemic hit, and basically two things happened. One, in response to public health concerns, employees are now working from home, working remotely, and therefore emptying out office buildings. And two, we had that economic response, not economic downturn, a lot of job losses. In fact, San Francisco's unemployment is now, I think, 12.6%. That's a huge jump from the 1.8% that I cited earlier, just a few minutes ago. We actually did a survey of CEOs here at the Bay Area Council, and we found that 18% plan to switch permanently to full-time remote work, more than triple the level pre-COVID. And more than 75% said they were planning to work partially from home. In addition, the vast majority of CEOs said that they plan to stagger work schedules and work times, and many said that they were also planning to change office layouts to allow for physical distancing. So what does this all mean for the future of commercial real estate, office demand, and the design and operations of our of the office market and office buildings? We are honored to have two experts with us to talk about and dig into the discussion. Colin Yasukochi is Executive Director of CBRE's Tech Insights Center and a 20-year veteran of the commercial real estate world. And Tanuj Mohan is Founder, Chief Technology Officer, and Chief Product Officer for Enlightened, which provides the world's most advanced building IoT platform for leading commercial and healthcare organizations around the globe. Welcome, Colin and Tanuj.
Thank you, Xiomara. Yeah, thank you.
Colin, I'd like to start with you. Let's go ahead and level set the conversation. For a while, we, like I mentioned before, office buildings were emptying out and there was high vacancies, but we weren't really seeing softening of the office rents until just recently. You just released your second quarter report. I'm hoping you could just share with everyone some of your findings and just share what's going on.
Yeah, again, thanks for having me today, and thanks to the people who are joining the call as well. And as you sort of described that, we were in one of the hottest real estate markets in the country up until sort of the pandemic hit, and obviously things changed pretty substantially after that effect. Now, the real estate market typically lags the overall economy by, anywhere from a few months to maybe 6 months or more, depending on what the individual situation is. And so, as the economic shutdown or shelter in place was kind of instituted here in the Bay Area, what we really started off with was job losses in sort of the hospitality, leisure, retail and restaurants, and the transportation sector. So most of the job losses didn't really have a whole lot to do with the real estate market, but obviously underlying the fundamentals of the real estate market are very much related to the economy. And so as we try to put into context what's happened so far in this second quarter, try to better understand how that impacted the real estate market. As most of you know, the Bay Area is dominated by the tech industry as it relates to driving commercial real estate. And within the Bay Area, it varies quite differently from the city of San Francisco to Silicon Valley. And so for those areas that I had mentioned, hospitality, restaurants, transportation, most of those companies that are either venture backed or were, most recently public and operate in those particular segments are based in the city of San Francisco. So when we looked at layoff announcements, what we found was that over 90% of the layoffs were in the city of San Francisco for employees that were based there. And that amounts to almost 12,000 job cuts that have been announced. Therefore, it has had a pretty big impact on our market. That's 10% of the tech workforce in the city, and tech represents about 35% of all office users in the city of San Francisco. In Silicon Valley is a much different situation where they have more established companies, and so they've been less impacted by the reductions in force as it relates to these economic situations that we've had. So giving that sort of a sense as a backdrop, here in the city of San Francisco, what we've seen is supply start to increase pretty dramatically as companies have laid people off and decided they may not have needed as much office space as they had anticipated, put sublease space on the market. And at the same time, because we are in a shelter in place, most people are working from home, as you mentioned, Ziamara, and it's hard to really determine what your office space's needs are in the future. And that's basically shut down the demand side where tenants have said, if I don't have to make a decision, I'm going to put that off till later. And any growth plans that I thought I was going to have, I'm going to also delay or maybe even cancel those in total. So because of those two factors of rising supply and falling demand, we saw office rents decline by 5% during the second quarter. So, thinking about that, puts our rents down by about $4 per square foot it's $84 a square foot. That's still a really high number because that's almost 2.5 times higher than where it was in 2010 when this big growth cycle started. Vacancy and the same thing has gone up. Sublease space, there's been an additional 2 million square feet added. We're at 5 million square feet of sublease space now. And for those of you on the call, sublease space represents extra space that businesses have that they want to try to lease that to some other tenant because they're still obligated to lease that space from the landlord as they originally committed to. And that 5 million square feet in perspective is slightly below the 5.5 million square feet peak that we saw during the post-dot-com era. So it's a pretty high number. Our expectation is that the market in San Francisco is probably going to continue to soften in terms of staying demand will be low, supply will continue to increase, and rents will continue to decrease really through the end of the year. And it probably won't be until the spring or the summer of 2021 that we're going to see any kind of real stabilization and meaningful improvement in the market. And just one other quick point as it relates to Silicon Valley. They've just really seen things flatten out there. Activity is low. Supply has gone up by a lesser amount, and rents have kind of been stable. East Bay has had a similar situation, although as San Francisco starts to see decline in its rental market, the Oakland East Bay is much more connected to San Francisco, so they're probably going to start to see some weakness in the months ahead. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Colin. That's you did a great job just providing the foundation for this discussion. Tanuj, I'll go ahead and switch over to you and more in terms of the response from the landlords or office operators perspective. Can you describe what Enlighten is doing and how you're pivoting your technology platform to address COVID-19?
Yeah, for some quick background, Shivamala, we are a building IoT platform. And what a building IoT platform is an infrastructure that provides hardware, networking, and software to provide data insights into the building. So these insights are around the environment, what's happening in the building, and what the tasks are being performed in the building. So we were putting this infrastructure in to future-proof the building and to make sure we not only understood the energy needs and the sustainability needs of the building, but also how we would gather data to improve the tasks that were performed in the buildings. After all, the buildings were built for the human being, and it has to be occupant or person-centric. So Enlighten's platform was initially used to serve energy efficiency goals. We started to use the same data for space planning, for an example, because we have sensors installed as a grid in the ceiling, and these are all time synchronized. So we can kind of reconstruct what is happening in the space. As people are moving around the space, we can detect people moving around the space. As you sit down in a cubicle or in a conference room and you nod your head, the sensors pick that up. And we post-process all of that data to get a sense of the utilization of the building. And we had a product called Space, where we were giving you not only the occupancy of spaces, but the utilization of a space. And the difference there is that if a conference room is a 20-person conference room and only 2 people were sitting in it, it was occupied but not utilized. Just on that anonymous data, we have started to use this for our COVID response for the customers that have our systems installed. We would have spaces that were green, that was thumbs up, very well utilized, and spaces that were yellow, moderately utilized, and red spaces that were, hey, underutilized. They were less than 20, 30% utilized. And now we kind of have to flip our world around. The spaces that are red are great. You are social distancing, and you are, preventing the spread of the virus. So it's funny that how we had to pivot the same application where we were trying to do densification, and now we are going completely the other way. But the sensor had other capabilities, and these capabilities are what we are starting to utilize. We had a Bluetooth radio sitting idle in the sensor that we knew in the future could have been used for asset tracking and other applications. We now are using it for applications around COVID. And it's actually getting very interesting how we are pivoting a true smart building, intelligent building infrastructure to actually utilize it for something that's future-proof. And we are moving the conversation away from facilities into the C-level, where now C-level folks are talking about how do you safely return to work. And we have been fortunate that we have been able to utilize some of the install base we have and provide feedback to our customers on how we can safely return them to work. So I can just go a little bit into what we are doing with the Bluetooth radio, and this is around contact tracing. This is while we don't have a effective treatment, or we don't have a vaccine, or we don't get to herd immunity, one of our only techniques is contact tracing to try and quickly mitigate the spread. Coming from a IT background and spending 10 years in the building background, we have a very good sense of privacy and security and the right balance for the right application. And that's something that we are able to balance when we bring a solution to the market. So we looked at having employees carry employee badges and visitors carry visitor badges. And these could be either attached to an individual by name, or they could be anonymous. And as these badges, and they could be a badge, they could be a wheelchair, they are just an ID. As these move through the space and they beacon, a Bluetooth beacon, which could also come from your cell phone, by the way. These beacons are looked at from the ceiling grid that is installed, and we provide location services. So at any given time, in real time, we are able to locate these objects. Now imagine you provided your employees with badges. Each one has a badge that is a Bluetooth beacon. And as they move around the space, their badges are located. An employee, and this is very similar to what happens even in the manual contact tracing sense, is that an employee who might be exposed or contracts COVID registers his badge voluntarily to his employer and say, hey, this is my badge and I have COVID. The system would then run a background report on people who were proximate to that badge, or spaces that the person used that were used by other people in the same time frame, and create a list of badges that might, or cell phones that might or might not have been compromised. So we could now inform the employees saying that, hey, if you are carrying this badge or you have this cell phone, you should self-isolate or quarantine because you have been in contact with somebody who has COVID. So it's quite amazing how a platform we had built for energy efficiency, maybe the Bluetooth radio was used, for being able to control the overhead lights with your cell phone, etc. And we are able to use it because it is more software defined. The thinking was, it's like your cell phone. You don't know what app somebody is going to build on it tomorrow. We built an infrastructure that had, headroom and was future-proofed so that other applications could be done. And it's unfortunate that it took a pandemic to raise the level of visibility of what a smart building needs to be to the C level when we are solving, the safe return to work problem we have today.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point, Tanuj. It's too bad that it's gone to this point, and we needed a crisis like the one that we're experiencing now. But it's a great thing that now we're thinking in more of an interdisciplinary way, and we're really thankful to have smart technologies and the type of tools that you're championing. I want to switch back to Colin, just dig in a little bit more on some of the comments that you provided. And I know I'm asking for you to do the impossible, but if you could just look into your crystal ball, what do you think is the outlook for commercial real estate in terms of demand and pricing over the next 6 months, year, what have you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think because the situation that we're in, where most companies can't really return to work, at least in their commercial office spaces, until maybe toward the end of this year, in many cases, not until early next year, that's going to have a dampening effect on demand. And at the same time, we sort of have more space coming to the market. So I really see that the price of commercial real estate as it relates to rents is going to continue to go down really through the end of the year, probably start to stabilize early in 2021, and then potentially start to go back up modestly, perhaps in the second half of 2021. And that's really more for the city of San Francisco. You look at other parts of the Bay Area, more like Silicon Valley, I think that they'll have a similar trend, but it'll be far less, where rents may only decline moderately through the end of the year and then stay flat, and then ultimately start to increase. And simply, again, because they have a much more mature and stronger tenant base of large tech companies there. And, Oakland has always benefited from San Francisco. So as San Francisco has seen weakness, you'll also see some weakness over in Oakland, but probably not quite to the same extent as San Francisco because of the tech firms who are operating in transportation and hospitality that had to make substantial layoffs and cut their amount of office space demand.
Great, thank you. And you also mentioned this earlier in your comments of just how our ecosystem of the economy is all interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen some job losses in the tech industry, but there's also the hospitality industry, the service workers, and how that's just so closely tied. Can you just talk about, more about those impacts on the commercial real estate? And it sounds like perhaps you could also broaden that geographically speaking.
Yeah, so I mean, the fact that I think a lot of those businesses are closed, obviously they're more on the retail side of the commercial real estate market. The prospects for especially those businesses that are located in downtown areas, may not be really all that great if the office workers don't return. And then a lot of it has to do with how comfortable we are patronizing restaurants, getting back into, the Ubers and Lyfts, traveling, and all of that has a lot to do with the value of commercial real estate. And so if our comfort level doesn't really return to anything close to where it was before, that's going to have a impact on real estate values, probably, pushing them down as opposed to just sort of remaining where they are. And there's a lot of talk around that in terms of, our downtown area is going to be in less demand because, especially here in the Bay Area, the downtown areas are very reliant on public transportation, which many people have a very strong aversion to from a health perspective of using. So that's going to have to return confidence so people can get back on mass transit because honestly, our society can't really function all that well without it. And we need to provide that opportunity for people to feel comfortable and get back on it. So I think until a lot of those particular areas, transportation, hospitality, retail, restaurants, all reach some sort of sense of safety and from a health perspective, that you're going to continue to see the real estate market be somewhat stalled.
And speaking of shift in demand from like downtown San Francisco, more urban areas, do you see that also perhaps increasing demand in the suburban areas? A lot of people have moved out of the city to spaces where you pay less for a bigger footprint. Do you see any shifting in terms of the office market in terms of geography from urban to suburban?
Yeah, we certainly fielded a lot of interest in trying to pursue that type of strategy where people could essentially, drive to work, park, maybe even walk upstairs rather than take an elevator. But at the same time, given the economic situation, many companies weren't really willing to make additional expenditures to be able to fulfill that strategy. So I think once they see what the new normal is with regard to using commercial real estate, then at that point they'll be in a better position to make those decisions, because I think it's still too early and very exploratory at this point. But the suburbs probably don't have enough office space as it relates to downtown areas to be able to accommodate that demand outflow. I think companies are really looking beyond the Bay Area in some cases if they're really trying to be more efficient with their costs and capital expenditures. That moving outside of the state is something that we might see an increase in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I absolutely agree. Going back to your earlier point of the need of our transportation system to uphold our economy, and luckily Barry Council is involved, the Blue Task Force. So we're very much thinking about how could we revitalize this effort, and we do need these innovation hubs. And I agree. Just generally speaking, right now we are surviving, not thriving.
Mm-hmm.
Tanuj, let's switch over to you. And dig in a little bit more about what you're seeing from your customers. Can you just share some of their concerns of how they're wanting to bring back their workers safely and do so in a social distance manner?
Yeah, so I think it's all about, for our customers, it's all about the health and safety of their employees. And they're looking to see, what they can do depending on the type of vertical they are. Each type of vertical has a slightly different take, and their priorities are slightly different. In the tech industry, a lot of us can work from home quite effectively. And, some of the large companies in the Bay Area, people know that they've been allowed to work from home till the end of the year. But for those who have to come into work, depending on the vertical, they are trying to make sure that I don't like the word social distancing anymore. Somebody pointed out that a lot of us are a lot closer actually right now, especially with family all around the world. It's probably physical distancing is the better word that we should have started to use, because that's what it truly is. That we are looking to see how we can put protocols in the office where physical distancing is maintained. We look at airflow so that people are not breathing the same air. We have more air turns, or people are in their own eddies, etc. But coming back to the question, people are balancing the health and safety of their employees, and this is the tough question, in a business. Let's say you are a factory and you have to get your people back to work, because otherwise, what do? They don't have a job. And then you have to worry about, what do you optimize for? How do you optimize for the right balance? And a lot of them are looking at compliance. That how do you make sure that you are compliant when you open, and so that if there is an audit, you don't get shut down. But the techniques we have are, like all of us know, we will put IR cameras or other temperature taking devices at the entrance to make sure we exclude people who are not well coming in the first place. And folks are educated that if they have been exposed, or they are vulnerable, they are of a certain age, or they have a certain underlying condition, etc., that they should not come in. So we are trying to prevent as much as possible from actually coming into the space. But once folks come into the space, we make sure that they are educated on proper physical distancing techniques. The spaces are reorganized so that, the corridors are one way, so that you don't go past each other, nobody sneezes in your face, etc. Desks are cordoned off so that every alternate desk is used. And we are putting all that in place. But because of the uncertainty that Colin mentioned, many people don't know how much money to spend right now, and whether they're going to keep the real estate or not, whether half their employees are permanently going to work in place. So it's kind of a very difficult decision to make, because the right infrastructure does require some spending, and it's a shame. The buildings are empty right now. This is the time to get America back to work again, where people can come in and safely do an installation, because there are a handful of people in large buildings, but the end customers are frozen because they don't know when they will actually utilize the building. So that is what we are actually hearing from the end customer. And then it comes about, how can I roll it out across my portfolio as quickly and as cheaply as possible? And then they boil down to, hey, I have a cell phone. Can you do something with the cell phone? And every employee does something with the cell phone. And employees hate that, because cell phones are something quite private, and they're not as effective in the building, because half the time you leave the cell phone at your desk for charging and other purposes. So in this time of uncertainty, we have to figure out how we do the right thing. We are going to go back to the building sometime, whether with a less dense building or reapply the building. But the buildings should be upgraded to support whatever happens in them. So we are doing our best to try and get people to safely bring their people back to work, or at least prepare the buildings, not necessarily bring the people back to work. Some people can stay working at home for a year or maybe even permanently, but when they need to collaborate, etc., the collaboration spaces are made safe. So that's kind of what we are really feeling. We are feeling that uncertainty from the end customer, where they know what the right thing to do is, but they're balancing the business, job losses, the fact that, they don't know how much portfolio they need with, with what is obviously a good thing to do.
Yeah, that's definitely, it comes with a big price tag, all of these investments and improvements, having to redesign your office space. I could certainly understand and appreciate the thought of wanting to be more certain about what the future looks like before making those investments. But either way, it's really fantastic that we have great tools like yours to prepare should we get to that point. And I just had another quick question. Enlighten just announced a partnership with Salesforce to create safe, connected workplaces. Can you tell us a bit more about that partnership and what's the goal of this partnership?
Yeah, no, we are super excited about that partnership. Salesforce has work.com and they have a number of tools that are around bringing people safely back to work, and they've done a lot of good work with the public sector and the states. And this work was around manual contact tracing, scheduling when people come into work, health assessment, and then kind of a command center for crisis management. So they have all the software tools that will be used to safely bring people back to work and to assess the situation and to respond. A lot of the work was manual. Let's say the contact tracing was manual. The way you do it today is that you would pick up the phone, talk to the person who's not well, ask him where you have been, who you have come in contact with, and then go inform those folks that you should isolate. But the platform from a software perspective doesn't really care where the data got fed into it. What Enlighted does is it makes all of this digital. We would just simply volunteer, the employee might go into the platform and say that, he has contracted the disease. The Enlighted system would, in kind of real time, go back and look at the reports, figure out who needs to be contacted. All that data would be fed up into the work.com application, and the folks would be informed. So we look at making a lot of the manual input go away, and it just be software data and APIs. And the and the other thing is we can also respond in real time, so we can kind of close the loop. So if you want to, you detect that a certain area has a lot of people in it, and you could remotely start blinking the lights on and off furiously, saying, hey guys, disperse. So you can close the loop and make things active. And that's where an Enlighted Light system with Siemens, with Comfy, can come in and react to all the work that is done across platforms. So I believe that the Siemens Salesforce partnership with Enlighted as a Siemens company and Comfy as a Siemens company can provide value into the platform where we are feeding real-time data, and we are also capable of real-time responses, which will make the difference.
Exactly. Thank you, Tanush. Yeah, efficiency and quick responses are key now more than ever. I think we'll go ahead and pivot over to audience Q&A. So again, reminder to everyone, go ahead and just use the Q&A function at the chat to ask your questions. So the first one, there's actually two regarding sublease space. How does the increase in sublease space compare to the Great Recession, the 08-09 downturn? And also, what does this mean in terms of potential opportunities for startup companies? I think, Colin, if you want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, sure. So when we look back in history as to where the other peaks in sublease space was, after the great financial crisis and recession, the sublease space increased to about 2.8 million square feet. I think the one point to understand a little bit there is that even though that's substantially less than where we are today, we're nearly at 5 million square feet, is that, we had outright bankruptcies of many of these large financial institutions. So that space that would ordinarily have been sublease space was simply given back to the landlord. So the impact on the market would probably have been larger than that 2.8 million would indicate. And if you go back one more prior recession, post.com, the number was 5.5 million square feet. So what's been interesting this time around is we've seen the sublease space go up quite substantially, is that initially through the first couple of months, most of the space that's come back to the market would be what I would consider on the smaller side, and smaller being like 30,000 square feet and less. So that would go down to, maybe a couple of thousand square feet. So it tended to be smaller blocks of space and smaller companies that put that on the market, which provides really kind of a good opportunity for many businesses to get into office space for less, because sublease space is usually at a discount to direct space, and anywhere from 15 to 20%, and to be able to take it for a shorter period of time, because your typical landlord is going to ask you for 5 years of more of rent term. And right now, I mean, if you're needing that space, you probably want to take it for a year or two at best. So there's going to be a lot of good opportunities out there for companies of all sizes.
Great, thank you. Next question for Tanuj. The big challenge we have in elevators, right now they're relatively small, and it seems like proper physical distancing could be very challenging. How do you see tenants dealing with this when employees are expected to return to work to their offices from home?
Yeah, I think I was in Japan maybe 3 years ago when I realized that lunches were scheduled based on the floors. Because of the high-rise buildings, if everyone decided to do a 12-to-1 floor, you ended up spending 20, 30 minutes waiting for the elevator in each direction. So Japan had to already stagger the lunches and say, okay, this floor goes to lunch at 11 o'clock, this at 11:15, so that they actually, distributed how people went for lunch. And this is the concept that we have to now use over here, that you have, times of entry into the building. So we reduce the load and spread it. It's not a 9 to 5 building anymore. It might be a 7 to 11 building where people come in from 7 to 11 and you have your slots to come in. So first you just reduce spread the people into slots. The next thing what should naturally happen is that a bulk of, at least initially, a bulk of your tenants should not be back at 100%. They should be back at 50 to 25%. So that should further reduce the load on the elevators. And then what you have to do is make sure everyone's wearing a mask. You put a cross on the elevator. Everyone is in the timeout box facing the wall, away from each other, and you have the fan on, etc. And you're moving as much air into the space as you can. I think that's kind of what I have seen happening. And this is a real issue. I've heard some companies say maybe we won't go do high rises ever again because we don't know how to solve this problem in earnest. This is COVID. It has, maybe a 10-minute face-to-face breathing time interaction needed for you to contract it, etc. But there might be something far more infectious and far more, deadly that happens. And then what do you do? So I don't think it is fully solved. We can just manage it, and the way you manage it is by the staggered entry-exit criteria, lowering the load on each floor, as well as making sure that people are in their own quadrants, wearing masks, facing away from each other. I don't know, Colin, have you done anything more than that? Obviously, the hand cleaning and all.
Yeah, I mean, we talked to a lot of customers who are in that predicament as well, and they're talking about the same things. They're going to bring back a small portion of their workforce. They're working with the building owners to figure out how the elevator situation works. There really isn't any good solution to being able to return to the type of occupancy that we had before. So many of the things that Tanuj says are what they're looking at, like, okay, well, only 2 people can go up in an elevator at a time. You got to stagger the hours in which people come into the building. None of it really works all that well if you think about how many people are at a typical office building. Just like, for example, since you mentioned you're working with Salesforce, the company that I work for, CBRE, is also at Salesforce Tower. And the building owner says that on a normal day pre-COVID, there's 5,000 people at that building, per day. And during this whole shutdown period, there's been maybe 10 or 20. So that gives you an idea of, and having worked at that building, when you show up in the morning, you don't get up there right away. It takes 5 to 10 minutes to be able to get up to your floor anyway.
Yeah, and one other thing one could do is designate elevators for specific floors. That way, if there is an outbreak, you contain it to people from a floor and you don't have all this cross-contamination that would be a nightmare doing contact tracing and things like that. So those are some other techniques you would do to kind of box in your exposure.
I don't want to belabor this point too much longer, but Reshma does have like a follow-up question to that. It just in terms of tying in sensing indoor air quality and monitoring personal eddies and microfilters in cubes. And also just elevating the point, is there a way to emphasize behavior solutions, low technology, maybe culture type change? I don't know if either of you.
I can give a few culture type changes. Before you have a smart system, as you walk into the space, the first thing our HR did was have these big laminated red sheets of paper that says dirty desk, and you have to pick one up. And as you go into the office, you leave it on your desk. So if you leave half day and somebody else comes in and you have hoteling or, flex desking systems, nobody sits in that space. And that's kind of a very low tech system. We put yellow caution tape on all the doors because we did not want people to come in from other doors. They can only come in from one door, go through the camera and the sign off that they're aware of what they're doing, and then leave from the other door. So there were like these big signs all around. We taped off half our desks with yellow caution tapes that don't sit here. So a lot of it we have done is low tech. We have taken out all the chairs from the conference room. So if it was a 10-person conference room, we have locked the chairs somewhere else. They're only for 3 or 4, depending on the conference room size, and they're put in the corners. So you cannot put 10 sitting people. So there are a lot of those subtle reminders that we have gone through the office that help. And these eddies and things like that, I mean, I'll just be honest, it is very expensive to do the true modeling of every single building, because you need a lot of data. You need to know, what the, where the chairs are, what the people are, where the vents are, what the CFM is, etc., etc. But there are some best practices that you can use. Is that, hey, where the air is blowing in your face, it's unlikely, and it's getting filtered, it's unlikely that you're breathing somebody else's air. So if you are feeling the air from above, that's the best place to sit. Do not sit under the return where it's sucking everybody else's air out. So there are a few things like that one could do, which are very low tech solutions. And you could just mark your building and make sure that you do these things as a best effort.
Yeah, I would just add one point that, hearing a lot of what you had to say, Tanuj, and that's like totally agreeable, and many other solutions that have been presented to us as a real estate company. I feel like with all of that, why don't I continue to work at home until the situation's resolved?
Yeah, that's fair. We're a creature of habits. It's hard to change those habits. So I know you answered this question already, Colin, through the Q&A, but I just wanted to ask it for the larger audience to benefit from the answer. But we've seen rental prices drop double digits for the first time ever, 11.8% in San Francisco, and 15% or more in Mountain View and Cupertino. So the question is, and usually it's like 1 to 2% drops, but if anything, a shift. But how do you think the reduction in demand for commercial real estate will impact demand for non-commercial real estate?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's really a couple of different components to that. So one from the rental housing side, which you had mentioned, I think the biggest impact there has been that because many of the tech firms predominantly have said you don't have to return to the office till sometime next year. In some cases said, well, maybe some of you don't have to return to the office at all. And if you live near your workplace and your lease expired or was coming up to expire, many people just simply said, why would I stay here in this high cost area? Why don't I move somewhere else? Maybe get a little bit more space. Maybe since there's a lot of younger people who work in tech, maybe go back home, live with your folks or do something different. So that's shown up very quickly in the reduced rent. And then just overall in general with job losses for many of the individuals who are working in hospitality and restaurants and retail that you typically see after a recession a lot of doubling up of households where ordinarily I might live on my own by taking a roommate or go move in with someone else. So that has the effect of reducing demand, which given the housing problems that we have in the Bay Area, it's not a bad thing. Although my fear is that it's only temporary and that we still have a massive mountain to climb when it relates to affordable housing in the Bay Area. And then I would just say that the second aspect we touched upon a little bit is the retail space, because to the extent that stores and restaurants and stuff can't really be open or customers are reluctant to go back, that's going to have a pretty big impact on the value of the rents and underlying properties in that sector as well.
Yeah, and going back to housing, I have to do a shameless plug here for our bill that we're co-sponsoring with California Forward, SB 1385. And this also is an audience question in terms of, do you see commercial space being converted to residential? This bill will allow residential on land zoned for office and commercial retail uses. So just looking at what we know in terms of the future, what are your thoughts in terms of using these spaces for much needed housing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's usually a difficult proposition in a lot of ways. So the way that could work is that the underlying value of these office buildings has to drop pretty dramatically. Otherwise, the cost to acquire that building and convert it to residential is just too high to make it feasible. So I'm not super enthusiastic that there's going to be a glut of office space and it's going to, drop in value by enough for someone to buy it and convert it to housing. Although post.com, that did happen because the value of office space had declined pretty dramatically because rents dropped by 2/3 and property values dropped by more than half. So it made sense for someone to come in there and to buy a distressed office building and convert it to residential. Two that I can remember off the top of my head, I want to say 74 New Montgomery Street used to be an office building that's now condos, and 201 Sansom Street, which is Sansom and Battery, I think, that was an office building that got converted to residential. And so you have to have a situation where the value of the property you're trying to convert has dropped precipitously. Otherwise, converting it just is not economically feasible.
And maybe it makes more sense for those sites that are like the dead malls, these like strip shopping centers, what have you. So that is a potential that we are looking forward to and still pushing our bill forward. Let's see. The next question, let's see. This one is a good one for the both of you. There's this, I think, anti-density rhetoric that we're hearing more and more because of COVID-19. What are your thoughts in terms of the lure of urban cities like San Francisco being damaged with the concern of people being conglomerated together, like in dense spaces?
My take, people have short memories. It is so funny that we don't seem to learn. So I believe that the young people love San Francisco. Silicon Valley was hot when I came here, and now we have to hire all the engineers out of San Francisco, and they won't come unless you are on the, on the train route to Silicon Valley. So I think it will go back. It's just a matter of time. But there might be some fundamental changes where the people are asking what's important to them in their lives. I have not seen so many people and so many kids outdoors before. I just came back from a backpacking trip, and I haven't seen young kids. This is the only thing people are doing right now. Earlier, the kids would probably be home in front of the TV playing a video game. I think some shifts like that, I don't think I can account for, but there might be some shifts like that where people, look at life as a whole and reevaluate their priorities. But other than that, I think the cities will come right back and people will forget. Just my take.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, obviously, the mass transit is going to be a big impact, but I think there's also a demographic trend that's at play here, because a lot of the tech boom that we've had right now and then the resulting density because of it has sort of been built upon the millennial generation and many of those joining tech firms. And the millennials are getting into their 30s. So that's sort of the natural time for them to want to, start families and move out of cities. So you certainly are going to see that trend naturally happening. And so the COVID-19 situation potentially accelerates that to a certain extent. But, cities, people forget about what had happened in the past. There'll be a vaccine at some point. People will come back. It just will take a little bit of time. It's not going to be as quick as, the fears of 9/11 faded pretty quickly. I think the fears of this pandemic will fade less quickly.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You took the words out of my mouth. Like after 9/11, we didn't want to fly. So I think people really appreciate urbanism for what it is, which is a space for innovation, for culture, and it's just a matter of doing density done well, which leaders like yourselves are really helping to move that forward. And speaking of transit, another question here. What kind of transit solutions are people using for essential workers in your office spaces? I'm not really sure,
I mean, as somebody who works for Enlighted and part of Siemens, we are recommending people who have to use mass transit to preferably stay at home, and right now just use your cars and come in, and that's the safe thing to do. So we don't have an answer for people who have to use mass transit other than work from home. So
Yes, I think also a lot of personal transit, that bike sales are through the roof,
yep.
Perhaps even scooters. So a lot of that kind of micro mobility, or at least for people who live within a reasonable distance to their work, as opposed to taking mass transit, that'll certainly be one solution. If you live close enough, then you should probably just walk to work.
Yeah.
yes. And eventually we'll be back on mass public transit.
We will.
Going back to using innovation like IoT to news. With older buildings and office buildings, do you see challenges in implementing tools like yours, platform like yours, as opposed to newer developments, new construction type buildings?
Yes, a little bit. You're right. In existing buildings, when people look at it, you might look at an LED retrofit and you might get an ROI, a return of investment in 2 years. And there's a siloed energy or a facilities buyer who just wants to say, hey, my KPIs are around energy, and I'm going to buy the cheapest thing so that I have the best ROI and I get kudos from my boss. But that's a very siloed approach, and that is what Enlighted and other people in the industry are trying to break and look at the holistic impact. Because if you are going to have a electrician in a ladder go up and install an LED light fixture, you might as well put in a sensor grid at the same time, because the bulk of the cost is in the labor. And you, for a little bit, more technology, if you put in at maybe 10, 20, 30% premium, you are future-proofing the building from a IoT and its capabilities for the next 10, 20, 30 years. But the decision making, however, every time boils down to, I have this one problem, can you solve it? And when you solve problems that might show up in the future or across many dimensions, it's very difficult to get the customer to understand what he is buying, because it's like, could I do this? Yes, you could do this. But right now, all I'm looking for, let's say a nurse call button, the nurse, the patient pressed a button and the nurse has to show up. Somebody puts an IR system and the, nurse wears an IR remote, and that works. You walk in, the nurse, and you correlate the two systems, you're done. But if you put it in a smart system, you would have a badge with the nurse and you would know where the nurse was, why she took so long to come. If she was carrying a vaccine, did she go to the coffee machine, make herself a coffee while the vaccine went out of temperature spec and came back into the room? You'd learn all of those things. But when people are looking for a solution, they sometimes put blinders on and look for a siloed solution and make the most cost-effective decision for that problem, for that solution. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges. In new construction, people are willing to experiment a little bit more, because when you put it in the context of $1 billion building, this is less than 1% of cost. So at that point, it's not that big a deal. But again, it's the last thing that goes in, so it's the first thing that they try and value engineer. But you can deal with that a lot easier than the siloed thinking that the current the current built environment has.
Okay, I think I'll just ask one more question for the both of you to ask, and maybe end on a positive note in terms of what can you envision for the best case scenario for the future of office with great technologies like IoT and clean, healthy office practices. What could be the future of office that could benefit from this pandemic and the lessons learned from this pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll go real quick first. That one of the trends that's been out there, but it hasn't really gained a lot of traction, is just this whole concept of a healthy office building. With fresh air intake, with occupants much more aware of their surroundings. So I think that the benefit of this pandemic has raised everyone's awareness as to how important health, safety, cleanliness, and all those things are related to an office building, because we just in the past have sort of taken that for granted. And it's really exciting, the kind of things that Tanuj is able to do through his company that really help facilitate that, and will probably extend beyond the pandemic with the kind of information that he's going to have available, through those products that can better guide employers who are using office space to better use and understand how their employees use the space, and what's the best method to make the most efficient use out of office buildings.
Yeah, no, I think I'll just echo that. Exactly right. We have to remember that the building was for the occupant, and once we get to occupant, comfort, safety, productivity, then we are doing the right thing. The building and the environment is serving its purpose. We built it for a reason, and the reason was for the occupant and the task he's performing. And I think people forget that over time. And you think buildings are buildings, let's go work on the building. And now you realize, no, let's think what the occupant has to do. What is the technology that will help the occupant? Can he not have to touch the door? Can an app on the phone open the door automatically for him, so he is completely touchless? He walks into his space, maybe he was running, so the guy says, I'll find you the coolest spot in the building, and directs him to the coolest spot in the building, and he has migraines, lesser light levels. It does it for him. We say these things and we have these proof of concepts here and there in smart buildings, but it is not ubiquitous. I think it is going to start becoming ubiquitous because we'll be forced to become smarter because of this pandemic, and a lot of these things will be, if it has to be touchless, if I need to know that there are only 3 people in the conference room and a red light goes out, I can use this fact to guide you to a phone booth that is empty because you just got up to make a phone call. So I think those things will come out a lot faster after this pandemic, because the infrastructure is going to be there and it is going to be used for sophisticated use cases. And the simpler use cases we have talked about for a decade will just become real.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you so much. And on that note, I just really want to thank again, Colin and Tanuj, for your time, for your sharing your expertise and insights. There was a lot to learn and to unpack. I learned a lot. So we will be sending a follow-up email to everyone that participated today with the link to the webinar and any resources we might have mentioned in this webinar, as well as a survey. So please fill that out and let us know your thoughts. And with that, again, thank you to our speakers and thank you to our audience for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.